Hello, I have a project that I am working on for a client, and the request is they have an amount, a dollar amount, that they want to spread over a period of time. So we have the start and finish date, as you can see here on the screen for each of these projects, and we had some planned revenue. Now, for this purpose, I'll give you a little context. In the accounting world, they have this term called revenue recognition. So even though you may not have billed the customer yet, in terms of revenue recognition, as the work's being performed, you are allowed to recognize that revenue. Now, what I'm showing today isn't specific, of course, to revenue recognition. It's any time that you have a dollar amount that you want to spread over a period of time, this technique will work. So let's get into it. I'm going to first, of course, go to my data tab. I've already created this table here, and if we take and look into table design, I've named it projects, but that's all I've done up to this point is create this table with these values. So under data, I'm going to choose from table range. Now, because I've already named that table and Power Query is recognizing that data, it has imported it into Power Query so I can get started. You'll notice here on the right hand side that there are two steps currently applied. One is it's identifying the source of the data, and many times when you're importing data from Excel or some known data source, it will attempt to guess what data types you have here. Now, for us, it's done a pretty decent job. It's recognized, of course, that this is text, but rather than recognizing this as a date, it has considered it to be date and time. I do want to make a change to that, so I'm going to make sure I have change type selected here, and I'm going to update this to only be a date. And it's going to say, do you want to add a new step or replace a current step? It's fine to replace the current step. So that has been changed, and now I'll move over to my finish date and do the same thing. For my planned revenue, it is recognizing it as a number. That's a good thing. But in some cases, you may have a planned revenue that has a decimal. So rather than leaving it a whole number while I'm doing this, I'm going to go ahead and set this to be a decimal number because it could be. And I'm going to again replace the current step. Okay, now that we've got our data types correct, let's get into the steps that we're going to need to do in order to distribute these dollars over a period of time. So the first thing I need to do is determine how many days are there between the start and finish date. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. I'm going to add a column to calculate the number of days between these two dates. So I'm going to go up and choose Add Column, and then I'm going to choose Custom Column, and I'm going to name this Days Between. And I'm going to use a pretty simple calculation here. I'm going to say duration.days, and then I'm going to enter my finish date, and I'm going to subtract my start date. Now what this would do is give me the number of days between those two dates, but we also want to consider that finish date. So I'm going to add a 1 to this. So +1. And now I have my days between. Let's go ahead and execute this, and then we'll see that it's correctly calculated that there are 31 days included within this date range. So we've got the 29th, 30th, and 31st of January, and then 28 days in February to get to our 31. Okay, that's step one. The next thing we're going to do is, of course, determine, now that we have, for our first project, we know that this is spanning over 31 days. We want to determine how much revenue to be considered for each of those days. So we can do another custom column, and this is quite simple. We're just going to call it amount per day, and I'm going to do a simple calculation of the planned revenue divided by the days between. So if I hit OK here, I'm seeing my amount. Now again, it's not quite getting this data type right. I'm not too concerned about this, although it's showing it could be some text here, and of course it's not. I am going to go ahead and set this to, again, to be a decimal number. Okay, so now we know that for project 0123, that we're going to use the amount of $49,741 for each day here that we could, if we're following the start finish date, and if this is equally distributed over that time period, we're going to say that on each of those days we'll be able to consider $49,741 as being revenue that we can recognize, or whatever calculation that you're trying to determine here. Okay, so the next thing I want to do, I really want to get this into a format that if I were to move it back over to Excel, that I could use a pivot table, and if I wanted to look at this in a month frame, I could do that. If I wanted to do it by week, I could do that. So what I really want to do in the end is I want to have 31 records for this project with this amount repeated. And once I do that, then I'll have down at the day level, the date level, the amount that we can take and summarize, and we can determine exactly what our revenue is going to be for a week, for a month, or a longer period of time. So in order to generate a row for each of those records, I'm going to need a list of dates in between these two dates. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and create a custom function. Don't let that scare you. They're very easy to do, and I'll show you how to do a simple one here, and then you can of course always build on this as you need to. So I'm going to choose new source, other sources, and I'm going to start with a blank query, and that would just kind of get us started. I'm going to name this function get days between, like that. And then I'm going to use the advanced editor. I find it a little bit easier to do it in here. So to start a function, we start that with the open and close in parentheses. And then within these parentheses is when we pass in our parameters that we're going to need inside of this function to do the calculation. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to pass in a start date, and I'm going to say that is going to be a date, and I'm going to do the same thing for our finish date. This is going to return a list. I'm going to say as list, and then I'm going to start our function here. Now, one of the first things we have to do, of course, within this query that we're turning into a function, is we got to start with that let keyword. And then let's go ahead and do the few steps that we need to do here. So the first thing I'm going to need is the same calculation that I used before to determine how many days are in between these two dates. So I'm going to again use this duration equals, and I'm going to say duration days. Same thing. Now we're passing in our start date and finish date up here, so that's what we're going to reference within this function here, and start date, and then again we want to add 1 to it so we can consider all of those days. Now that we have that, now we want to generate a list of those dates between that. In order to do that, we'll call this date list, and we're going to use this list.dates function, and from here I need to, as you can see in the IntelliSense here, it's asking me for the start date. Now we know what the start date is because it's getting passed in. Then it's going to ask us for the count. Well, we determined that in the previous step, and we can just pass in that duration. And finally, it's asking us for the step as a duration. Now, we could be generating it based on the hour, the minute, the month. But in our case, we just need to do it by day. So I'm going to use this special function here that you may have seen. And now, of course, this pound duration is available in that M language reference that you can find on Microsoft's documentation site. And here all I need to do is say I'm going to do this at the day level, and then the rest of these are going to be zeros. Okay, so that gives us what we need to generate a date list. And then finally, we want to come in and put our in keyword, and we're just going to return that date list that we just generated. So let's look at this again. We're going to pass in a start date and a finish date. We're expecting it to return a list, and then we've got our two steps here. We're determining the duration based on the finish and the start date, and then we're asking Power Query to generate us a list of dates using that start and finish date and the duration that we calculated. And then we're returning that date list. So I'm going to hit done. And then once you create a custom function like this, it will prompt you where you could test it. So we're going to go ahead and test it before we move any further. It's always a good idea to test. So let me, for the start date, I'm going to hit our little calendar here, and I'm going to put in October 1st. And for our finish date, I'm going to choose October 5th. And then if I invoke that, you'll see that I'm getting back a list, the exact list that I want. Here's our start date, here's our finish date, and it's giving us all the dates in between. So we know that our custom function is working. So that generated another query just to invoke that and test it. I'm going to remove that just to clean up a little. And then I'm going to go back to my projects query, and now I'm going to use those dates within my projects query. So in order to do that, we can add another column, but instead of custom column, we're going to choose invoke custom function. And then here I'm going to call this date, because ultimately it's just going to be the date. And then I'm going to choose function query, get days between. Once I've selected that, it knows that that function is expecting a start and finish date. Now I could put in a date here, but of course we want to use the start and finish date from our row. So in order to do that, I'm going to drop this list down, choose column name, and then I'm going to choose start here, column name, finish. Now that I've got everything populated, I hit OK, and then you'll notice that it's added that date column here, and it's got a list. So if I click inside of this list, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, I can see the dates that it's generating. So I know that it's working. So now you may ask, okay, now you've got a list of dates for each of these projects. What do we do to generate a row for each, for every value in that list? Well, that's pretty simple actually. If we go up into the upper right and we click this double arrow, you'll see that it says expand to new rows. So if I click that, now for each of those projects, for the number of the dates within that, it's generated a row for each of those. So if I scroll down and take a look at this, you can see that it's generating that for us. Okay, now that we've done that, we've got everything that we need now. But I'm going to do a little cleanup to Excel. I want to make sure I've kind of got it cleaned up. So the first thing I'm going to do is I no longer need the start and finish date in this particular query. I don't need the planned revenue, and I don't need the days between. I really just need those these three columns. So I'm going to select those. I'm going to choose remove column. And then the final thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to, again, because it was a list, it wasn't sure what kind of data was inside of that. I'm going to make sure that Excel knows that this is also a date. So now that I've changed that to date, I've got all my steps listed here. I can see how the data has changed as we've went through the steps. And then finally, this is our data set that we want to send back over and use in Excel. So now that we have that, I'm going to choose close and load. and we're going to see that it's generated us a new projects tab and included our data in it. So now that I have this, I can use standard query functions, Excel functions. I'm going to insert a pivot table that's recognizing the correct table. It's going to put it in a new workbook. That's fine. And then from here, I can choose project as my row. The amount per day is my value. Now I'm going to go ahead and update the value type for that. I'm going to set that as a number with 2 decimal places. Yes, I'll use the 1000 separator. I'll hit OK and OK. And then finally, I'm going to move my date down into the column. Now, by default, what Excel's going to do is going to recognize that it's a date here, and it's going to, as you can see over in our pivot table fields, it's created, although I dropped the date there, it knows that you probably don't want to see all that detail. It knows you want to summarize it, and you can see from the pivot table, you can now see that if these dates are correct, we can expect $1.9 million of revenue we can recognize in January, 4.3 for February, and 3.8 for March. So I hope that helps you. If you have something like this, well, this is kind of a special case where we have a value that we want to distribute over a certain amount of days. This is an easy way to go about doing it. Create that custom function that only has a couple of steps in it, and then you can use that custom function as much as you want. I hope you found that helpful.